Tomorrow is Remembrance Day in the UK and also Veterans Day in America. And quite rightly, we remember our fallen, we remember the lost lives, the shattered families, and all of those that sacrifice themselves for our way of life. And it's entirely appropriate that it has become more important in our society in recent years with Afghanistan and Iraq than perhaps before. And it's also important because it reminds our children that they too owe a great debt to their ancestors and people in their current society who've been through this process. But I think more importantly, or as importantly, it should catalyse politicians to ask the question, how did these wars break out? What could the politicians in the time have done to change the outcome? And if you just look at 3 examples and look at the lessons, there is a message for our politicians today. Taking the First World War, after looking at the way the war broke out, one has to conclude that Germany was innately the aggressor. It was expansive and it sought to challenge France on the way to challenging Britain. For politicians not to have recognised that in Britain, not to have actually safeguarded and thought about what would happen on the continent when Germany tried to replicate its success in 1870 in the Franco-Prussian War, and not to have thought about the scale of an army required to help the French was, I think, negligent, although it went against the past policy of Britain not having a large armed force. I don't think perhaps it would have been acceptable to have a large standing continental army, but we could have at least had the preparations to create one, instead of taking 2 years to put Kitchener's army in the field and creating what was inevitably a learning process of the Battle of Somme, and a number of years before it became effective and in fact dominant. And during the first 2 years that it took Britain to come to France's aid, France was exhausted. Imagine what would happen if France and Britain fought alongside each other when France wasn't exhausted, and it may well have shortened the war. But I think even more important was the ambiguity of the Anglo-British alliance. And the Germans didn't know whether Britain would come on the side of the French when they invaded, and it was up to the politicians to make sure their alliance was rock steady. And indeed, NATO was exactly lessons learned, and that was successful in creating a bond of alliances that were determined to act together if they were threatened by the USSR. The second lesson is really, in the Second World War, in the 30s, Britain went through the same process of just not coming to terms with Hitler's intentions and not being prepared. And we found ourselves with once more a slightly larger but still small continental army. In the end, it was not capable, not prepared. It was evicted with the fall of France. We lost all our equipment, and it placed Britain in a vulnerable position. Again, a lack of preparedness. However, in the Cold War, the lesson was learned. Deterrence, nuclear weapons, and conventional strength, to some degree, was recognised. And if you look at the success of the Falklands conflict and Thatcher's involvement, of the determination to control or respond to aggression 8,000 miles away, we tend to think of it as a small colonial throwover, but their waves ran all the way up to the doors of the Kremlin, and they changed their policy with respect to perceiving capitalists to be weak. And that changed the concept of intention to defend oneself. And looking at the Soviet records, you had the combination of Reagan and his military expansion policies, coupled with Thatcher and her determination, and dare I say it, a strong defence policy in the UK to act as a bridge between Europe. And you had a very effective deterrent, both in capability and intention, that I believe deterred the Soviet Union and the last vestiges of economic collapse from rolling the military dice. That was an excellent example of how deterrence should work, and one that wasn't really operating in the First World War prior to it, or the Second World War. Deterrence failed and war followed. And if you look at the one lesson for politicians, is that deterrence is vital to prevent conflict. And deterrence means effective armed forces and the political intention to use them. And however much that seems to be expensive at the time, believe me, it is far cheaper to invest in deterrence than to take the consequences of a war lost or even won and the impact on society. And yet those lessons are constantly lost in modern politics. So the most important lesson today is essentially that deterrence is still vital, that war is a blight on human behaviour. It hasn't disappeared. And it would be appropriate if politicians took Remembrance Day and Veterans Day to try and absorb the lessons of the past, to think about their actions today in failing in the Western world. And I have to talk about Obama because he has a lack of intention, even though his armed forces are very capable. And I look at the current government, who seem to think defence policy is lowest down on the list, have effectively hollowed out the armed forces and have demonstrated zero intention in deploying and acting with any kind of coherence. And what we're doing in this modern day and age is we are exposing ourselves to the hostility of Russia, which is cornered for various reasons, the rise of ISIS, and ultimately the biggest elephant in the room, the rise of Chinese military power. On Remembrance Day, it would be appropriate to think about all of those that have lost their lives to protect our way of life. And it seems at the moment our politicians are failing to honour that sacrifice by understanding the lessons, incorporating them, and ensuring that the Western world is made safe with the investment in defence and strong deterrence. And I often wonder what it would be like to ask those that have lost their lives to comment on where we are now. And I think the simplest answer was expressed by the poet and the famous In Flanders Fields by John McCrae, the Canadian. And the last three lines sum it up. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep through poppies grow in Flanders Field. And I can't help but think that politicians today in the Western world have and are breaking faith with those that have sacrificed so much for us to live the way we do today.